Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar. We're just going to wait 1 minute to allow some more people to join, and then we're going to get started at that point. But you've come to the right place if you're here for a webinar on tracking preparedness. So hello again. I'm sure we will have some more people who join us, but we're keen to get started so we can make the most of this hour that we have. So a very warm welcome to today's webinar. My name is Hugh Salway, and I am Senior Director for Market Development and Partnerships at Gold Standard. And today's webinar is on tracking preparedness, launching the Gold Standard Carbon Market Regulation Tracker, and reflections from our partners. I joined Gold Standard at the beginning of 2021, so just over 3 years ago. And if we were doing this webinar back then, we would have quite little to say about the issue of regulations affecting carbon credits. But over those past 3 years, we've seen multiple new regulations emerging across the world that govern activities related to carbon credits. Some of these regulations are focused on the supply of credits, for instance, how projects need to be set up, what approvals they need, and where the money goes. Some of these are focused on the demand side, how companies can use credits, the claims they can make, and what they need to disclose. And meanwhile, other regulations which we're seeing are really starting to put in place the convergence between the voluntary and compliance carbon markets that's been long discussed. And all of these regulations, all of these changes which we're seeing globally matter for those who are looking to play a role in the carbon market, whether that's as project developers, verifiers, standard setters, investors, or others. And with that in mind, last November, Gold Standard launched a new initiative with support from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, which involves a series of activities really focused on supporting and adapting to this transition to a more regulated global market. And the place that we wanted to start is in mapping these regulations which are emerging globally and making them publicly available and accessible for any market actors and partners who we work with. And last month, we were very pleased to launch this product at Gold Standard. So on our website, you're now able to find a public tracker of carbon market regulations across the world, tracking regulations related to carbon credits, whether thinking about their supply, their use, or their use within compliance regimes. And what we wanted to do there was to create a one-stop shop for anyone that needs to understand what regulations may affect their activity, or those who are interested in assessing trends and differences across jurisdictions. And we were really delighted to work with South Pole on the development of this tracker and to be able to invite them to present it in today's event. So what we're going to do today is really two things. So in a second, I'm going to invite South Pole to present an overview of the carbon market regulation tracker and how to use it. And then we're going to move to a panel session after that with experts from South Pole, from Abatable, as well as from Gold Standard, where we're going to discuss and look at some of the trends that we're seeing in public regulations and why these matter. And throughout the webinar, you'll find that there is a Q&A function. Please feel free to write any questions that you might have through that Q&A function, and we'll answer as many of those as we can through the webinar and then in the Q&A session, which comes at the end. But I'm very pleased at first to be able to introduce Daniel Sachadonig, a consultant on policy and strategy at South Pole, who's going to present some slides to talk us more through the regulation tracker. So Daniel, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh, and I hope everyone can see this. But in any case, hello and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Daniel Sachadonig, and I'm a consultant at South Pole. And it is my pleasure to introduce you today the Gold Standard Carbon Market Regulations Tracker. Just before diving into the specifics of the tracker and the assignment, I'd like to take a moment to introduce South Pole, whom both my colleague Caroline, who will speak later on the panel, and I have the pleasure of representing today. South Pole is an impact-driven global expert in carbon projects and a climate consultancy. We partner with and advise governments, public sector organizations, and private sector companies, guiding them on their decarbonization journeys. And with our team of over 800 sustainability advisors, scientists, engineers, South is one of the largest advisors on emission reduction projects worldwide. But let's talk about the tracker and the reason that this tracker has come into being. Over the past year, as Hugh has already alluded to, we've witnessed the introduction of new regulations and frameworks governing carbon market activities across really many different jurisdictions. And of course, many governments are continuing to develop their approaches to carbon markets. For us, what does this mean? In our view, it means that governments are really recognizing the potential of carbon markets and are taking responsibility for regulating them. It also means that it's an indication that this market is maturing, which is an essential precondition for them to scale and actually also deliver on their promise and their potential. And in this context, it's important that both private sector and public sector actors receive the support they need to navigate a landscape that is becoming increasingly complex. And what we see from the regulations is that developments across countries are by no means uniform. Each country is taking their different approaches to achieve their own stated objectives, and this is contributing to this increasing complexity and is also creating this need for having publicly accessible information. So our objective with this tracker was to establish a public access hub for carbon market actors to find information on the development and the implementation of these regulations globally. And currently, this tracker covers 41 regulations across 29 jurisdictions. These regulations are particularly relevant because they allow for the presence of independent crediting standards, such as the gold standard. And of course, we are continuously updating this tracker by adding more regulations as they become available and develop, ensuring that the users, you have the most current information available. The target group for this tracker includes all participants in this market, really. So project developers, auditors, buyers, and anyone involved in carbon market activities. And our aim was to support these stakeholders in providing reliable sources of information to help see these actors, to help them see these new market opportunities. So how do we go about this exercise? And so the approach that we took here was to collect data that on regulations that affect both the supply and the demand for carbon credits. And so this included compiling information on government actions that boost carbon markets demand, such as directives on claims, but also compliance schemes where carbon credits can be used. But also those regulations that really affect the supply. So they're really a heterogeneous group of documents. These can be operations manuals, guidances on project development, policy frameworks, etc. And after screening these regulations that could potentially fall within the scope, we identified 41 that we deemed to be within interest, within scope of this assignment. And so those that we have included in this first iteration of the tracker can be divided into three broad groups. The first group includes regulations on Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market, the VCM. And so this includes, for example, Ghana's carbon market framework, the laws related to carbon economic value in Indonesia, or, for example, regulations on the domestic carbon market in Costa Rica. The second group we coined compliance, and it includes rules and regulations for those carbon pricing schemes that allow for the use of carbon credits to fulfill compliance obligations. And examples for that are the carbon tax in Singapore, but also the carbon taxes in South Africa or Colombia. And the third group that we included in this tracker are those that are claims related. And these claims related rules and regulations govern the permissible types of claims that can be made with the use of carbon credits. So, for example, in California, there's the Voluntary Carbon Market Disclosures Business Regulation Act, or in the EU, the Directive on Substantiation and Communication of Explicit Environmental Claims. And we included this because we think that these regulations also influence the demand for these credits. Just a small note on the terminology that we've used. And so we use regulation quite in a broad sense. So it's not only specific regulations issued by regulatory body, but laws that can be passed by by governments and both formal and informal guidances and guidance documents that have been issued by any type of administrative agency. So what type of information does the tracker include? So we conceived it to provide quite broad information on these regulations, and in this breakdown on top, on this pyramids, the details. So of course, what is the name? What is the type of this regulation? Is it an instrument? Is it a policy document? Is it a guidance on claims? What is its status? Has it only been proposed? Is it scheduled to be implemented? When has it been implemented? And also, who are the relevant stakeholders? So we really, for each regulation, try to identify the main stakeholders that will be affected by a particular regulation. Then on a second level, the summary of the regulation itself. And this is really, I guess, the meat of the tracker, where we summarize the primary document, the regulation, and we include information on the institutions, typically the institutions that are involved, what are the processes, and what kind of documents have to be filled out. So many regulations have different schedules, different templates that would have to be completed. Or, for example, also what are the information on fees, like what has been said about benefit sharing, for example. And lastly, the layer of contextual and further information. So we try to also provide information that allows the user to situate the regulation in their proper political context. So we provide links to news articles, to, of course, the regulations themselves, but also things that give more context. So, for example, in the context of Article 6, what are the existing bilateral agreements that a country may have already signed, or relevant memoranda of understanding? And so with these different types of information, we try to cater to also different stakeholders. Some of you may want to know which authority has issued a regulation to later on get in contact with them. Others may want to get an overview of what the registration process looks like, or what a particular regulation says about monitoring or about the fees. At the same time, it's definitely not too extensive. We wanted to provide a handy and compact summary of what the regulation includes for you to see, is there something that is of relevance for me? Does this have any consequences? So to give another global overview of the geographic spread, here you see the map of the regulations we included from which countries. And again, it's important to note that this is a living database. We will be adding more regulations during our monthly updates to ensure that you have the most current information. But let's also take a live look at the tracker. And here it is hosted on the gold standard website, and you end here with the map that will be interactive but isn't yet. And on the top left, you can click on the geographic region of your interest, and let's click here on Africa. And here I've had already Ghana opened, and here you can see all the information that I just mentioned before. What is the type? Which authority issued this particular regulation? Is it enforced? What's the entry force date? And also the stakeholders that this was relevant to. And in the summary, not too long, but we provide information on what is stated on Article 6, what is stated about the authorization, which institutions are involved, so what is the governance framework of this particular document, the development process, what is said about validation, registration, the MRV, and most importantly, perhaps, what are the fees associated with activity development, and the related bilateral agreements, and of course links to the document itself, as well as the agreements and any other articles that might be of relevance here. Again, you can download the entire underlying spreadsheet to this that will be updated monthly. Here towards the top of the website, it will download in Excel. And yeah, with that, I hope that the tracker will be useful to you, and that I was able to give a good snapshot of what you can find there. And with that, I'll hand back to Hugh, and also then to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was great. So a couple of the questions that we received in the Q&A there about the frequency with which this information will be updated. And I think, Daniel, you just mentioned that. So we're looking to update information on a monthly basis so that this stays pretty regular as we go forward as well. So we hope that this will be helpful. Great. If there are any more questions related to the tracker, feel free to write them into the Q&A, and we can either write answers back or we can respond verbally to those questions. So feel free to keep them coming. But for now, we're going to turn to our panel session, and I'll invite the panelists to put their videos on. So for this panel, I'm very pleased to welcome three guests. Caroline Cazier-Diaz, Global Senior Director for Article 6 at South Pole. Greg Lidker-Morris, Policy Manager at Abatable, and Kavya Bajaj, Government Relations Manager here at Gold Standard. And in this panel session, we're really going to look a bit more about what some of these tracker regulations mean, which we've identified in the tracker, what to expect in the future, and what some of the key implications are for different types of actors. And we'd really welcome your comments and your questions in the Q&A as we go. But I'm going to start with a question to you, Caroline. So Daniel mentioned there that there are broadly three different types of regulations that were identified. So one related to project development for Article 6 or the VCM, one type related to compliance regimes and the use of credits within those regimes, and another related to the regulation of claims that are made by buyers who are using credits. It'd be great if you could say a little bit more about the key themes in each of these different areas and what they might tell us about what to expect in the future.
Thanks, Hugh. Yes, with the pressure to implement NDCs mounting, we've really seen a wave of regulatory activity worldwide for the past 2 years or so. In the first category that you mentioned, regulations targeting project development for Article 6 and for the VCM, we've really seen a very diverse set of regulations come out. Daniel already spoke to that a little bit. You get high-level frameworks like in Bhutan and Rwanda. You get very detailed step-by-step guidance like we've seen come out in Cambodia. A lot of that regulation deals with Article 6. Of course, Article 6 requires quite a bit of government involvement before transactions can take place. But in the wake of that, we're also seeing an increasing amount of countries regulating voluntary carbon market activity. You see that at the national level, but in certain places, especially federal countries, of course, also at the regional level. Malaysia is an interesting example there. And what's clear is that countries that do come out with a clear and solid regulatory framework are then able to also attract a lot of projects, a lot of investments, a lot of project developers. So as diverse as the set of regulations is, for me, the common thread really is that you see developing countries, host countries, asserting their priorities, are certain that their ownership of this agenda, their climate priorities, their climate finance priorities. I come from a development finance background myself, and for me, that's really where the beauty of Article 6 as a mechanism lies, is that it allows countries, developing countries and host countries, to assert that their own priorities and to take a strong negotiating position at the table, much more than when you're, for example, negotiating a loan. Article 6 is structured like that by design and then also by the market dynamics. It's a market that's projected to be short in supply for the foreseeable future, so that puts these countries in a really interesting position. And they are realizing that, and they are increasingly leveraging carbon markets as a tool to channel money into their economies, to channel financing towards poor communities, towards conservation, towards clean energy, and so forth. And governments are then also starting to take their own share of that financing, channeling that to their treasuries through registration fees, to percentage shares, through corresponding adjustment fees. So that's the first set of regulations dealing with project development under Article 6 and the VCM. A second set, as we heard, deals with the use of credits in domestic compliance systems. You have that in countries like Singapore, South Africa, Chile, Colombia, and more. What's happening here is that these countries allow for the use of offsets under their domestic compliance scheme. So you can use a carbon credit as an offset within under a carbon tax or within an emission trading scheme, an ETS. Mostly this happens using domestic offsets, but we also see countries making use of international offsets, like Singapore, for example, and Japan and Korea are somewhat moving into that direction. Using credits as offsets within a national compliance scheme really encourages corporates to invest in climate action. Beyond the sectoral and geographical boundaries of your national compliance scheme, of your carbon tax and of your ETS. So you can imagine, for example, a Singaporean corporate offsetting a share of their tax liabilities by financing community projects in Lao PDR, to give an example. It also allows to channel funding to projects that may have stronger social and environmental co-benefits than when you're just looking at in-house decarbonization of the entities that are subject to your national tax or to your EPS. And it brings in a bit more flexibility in the national compliance schemes. It can reduce compliance costs for entities that are subject to a tax or to an ETS, and it softens the economic burden of the system. So in that sense, it can also help in getting more political buy-in for a domestic compliance scheme when you're setting it up or trying to tighten the cap. I think a best-in-class example here really is Singapore. Singapore has an ambitious tax. It allows to offset up to 5% of the tax liability through the use of ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And what's really interesting about Singapore is that they make use of the independent standards for that, like gold standard. So it's a smart, regulated use of independent standards within the domestic compliance scheme, which allows for rapid action, for scalable action, and for more ambition than what you would have if you didn't introduce offsets within the system, and it allows you to move the implementation much faster than when you go through the tedious process of setting up your own domestic standard first. So I think Singapore is a really interesting example. And then thirdly and lastly, regulations relating to claims. This is about policymakers making it easier for consumers to understand and trust what they see in the market and to make more informed decisions. So riding the wave of consumer protection initiatives, we see regulation about claims coming in. It's of course a reaction to the increasing amount of litigation that we've seen around greenwashing and the media scrutiny that the market has been facing. EU and California really are ahead of the pack here. But many other countries, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, and New Zealand, are coming up with this type of regulation. In some cases, that's mandatory guidance, like in the EU and California, in the US. In some cases, governments opt for voluntary systems, like Australia and New Zealand have done. What's really interesting here is to see how some of the voluntary initiatives in the market that have been created to establish more end-to-end integrity in the market, like the VPMI, are now focusing people's attention, bringing more awareness about the importance of exact terminology and changing or inspiring regulators to translate some of that thinking into regulation.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass to Greg from Abatable. So one of the differences between what one of the kind of features of what we have tried to do for this carbon markets regulation tracker is provide information on regulations, but there's no assessment which goes alongside that of kind of quality of regulations, anything else alongside that. And that's a deliberate step by us to provide information, but not go further. But one of the things that Abatable does is provide carbon policy scores for each country on its platform based on its assessment of the regulatory framework. It'd be great if you could share a little bit more about Abatable's model, how the score is calculated, and point to a few examples of good regulation globally right now and what it is that makes them good. So we heard from Caroline just now about Singapore, but it'd be great to hear about a few more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hugh, and congratulations both to Gold Standard and South Pole on launching this tracker. It's really exciting and necessary feature for the market. So firstly, in terms of our policy scoring at Abatable, so we've built a framework of the key policy risks that we see in the market as carbon markets become more regulated in countries, and we're really focused on the supply side of policy. So we're looking at things like are countries banning the export of credits from voluntary projects? How are they implementing, if at all, Article 6 processes? Are they regulating benefit sharing rules, or defining carbon rights, implementing taxes, and some other key areas that we saw from speaking to participants and looking at policy landscapes were really crucial regulatory risks being faced by the market. So we then, as we assess different countries and we speak to experts within those countries, such as policymakers and developers and lawyers, we look at each of those risks in turn in the country, and we assess the current state of play, what it is right now in the country, and then also how potentially that's changing in the future and at what time scale. So that really allows for consideration of whether regulation is being brought in, what features of the market are going to be regulated, whether that is beneficial or not for the market. And we then apply a score to each risk area in the country, both on the current state and in the future state. And that obviously allows it to total through into an overall score, looking at the current state and future state again of that country. And we review this each quarter to ensure all country assessments are up to speed, and that's where that network of experts we utilize in those countries can really give that insight around how the country is developing its markets and at what pace. I think a few things I'd probably note before giving the examples is the increasingly, and you touched upon this at the start, Hugh, regulatory risk was not necessarily a thing in this market a few years ago, but it's become a really, really major issue for market participants we speak to, so investors, developers, buyers of credits. And across the board, really, I hear now that the market participants want regulation. They want quite detailed regulation that covers all these elements, because that gives them clarity and confidence when they're developing a project or putting money into a country, investing in projects, of the kind of certainty of what they get out of that. So we need that regulation to unlock this flow of finance to make sure we have impact, and there's been a lot of unexpected policies in recent years that have had quite a cooling effect in some countries. Secondly, as is quite visible on the tracker, not that many countries have really detailed regulation on the supply side. I think it's coming, it's being developed, but it is quite challenging. We're seeing parts of Africa in particular leading the way, probably on carbon market frameworks. So it does make kind of what is best practice a difficult thing to define, given that there's not that many examples to go off, and even fewer of those examples that are actually really operationalizing at scale. But when a country releases new regulation, probably the first thing I'm looking for is, okay, what's happening to the current projects on the ground that have been working in the current voluntary market? Can these projects continue, and in what shape and in what form? So one example that I like here is Rwanda. If you look through the regulation they released, I think last year, it's got a really defined role of what the voluntary carbon market is, what it has been and continues to be, alongside the Article 6 market that they're bringing in and the authorization around that. It defines how the VCM can support the achievement of its unconditional and conditional NDC versus the Article 6 market supporting its conditional NDC. And so as a developer of an investor in a project in Rwanda, it gives me that security and clarity of my project being secure and certain to continue in the coming years as the markets develop. But on the Article 6 side, perhaps the kind of the best example I would give would be certainly Ghana's regulation. It brings a lot of clarity for anyone looking to operate in Ghana. There's a project whitelist and red list, so those project types that are eligible to apply for an authorization, a letter of authorization to achieve a corresponding adjustment and be transferred out of the country and away from Ghana's NDC, and it's well aligned with the with Ghana's NDC. Again, mentioning the corresponding adjustment credits linked to the conditional targets, and that gives me a huge amount of confidence that the policymakers that have developed this have really looked at the NDC, thought about how Article 6 can support the achievement of their NDC, and gives me confidence they're not going to, say, revoke these credits in the future. It's also got, secondly, really good detail around the timelines, the administrative process, the institutional frameworks, and probably quite crucially, really detailed, laid out fee structures, so including the costs of requests for authorization, the corresponding adjustment fee itself. So as a developer or an investor moving into Ghana, I've got really clear vision of what I can and cannot do and what that's going to cost me ahead of operationalizing my project. So Rwanda and Ghana are two that I'll highlight here that look good due to the detail and clarity that they provide. Hand back to you now, Hugh.
Great. Thank you, Greg. That's really helpful. And I see a lot of questions coming through on the Q&A, which is great. And we'll make sure we can get to as many of them as possible in the last 15 or so minutes of this session. But Kavya, I'm going to come to you now. So Kavya from Gold Standard as well. So, I mean, as Gold Standard, we have over 3,000 projects in more than 100 countries globally. So regulations which take place in different countries have a bearing on projects that are using our standard. But it'd be great if you could say a little bit more about how you and how we see the role of a standard when it comes to new regulation.
Thanks, Hugh. I just want to check firstly if you can hear me. All right, great. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be on this panel. And just to start off with answering Hugh's question, the role of Gold Standard. So to start off, today we have over 20 years of experience in carbon markets, and we started as a standard to support integrity in the CDM. So over our experience in voluntary and compliance markets, we have integrated into our standard certain criteria to ensure stakeholder inclusivity, for example, SDG-linked impacts that are holistic, rigorous safeguarding, and real outcomes into our standard. So our principles and requirements have evolved aligned to these ideas in a way that we continuously innovate, for example, through digitization, through new methodologies, even now crediting approaches, and alignment with international standards such as Article 6, CORSIA, ICBCM, etc. And for these initiatives, we've received international recognition from international buyers, for example, or project developers, and now even governments. So this is all to say that we want to support governments both implement and design regulations in a way that meet their national objectives. And we have developed the capacity over 20 years, or expertise over the last 20 years to do so. And we want to support the development of and design and implementation of these regulations in a way that caters to the needs of the local population within that country, within that jurisdiction, and their environment, and support project developers and other market stakeholders in alignment with high integrity, high impact principles that we have over the last 20 years tried to integrate into our standard. So over the past couple of years, and as many regulations have emerged, as we can see captured on this regulations tracker, we have been engaging with governments across the globe in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, etc., and developed a program, as we'd mentioned earlier as well, to these ideas. We've developed a program aligned to these ideas to support the transition to a nationally regulated carbon market, which also is the name of our program, and this under which this regulations tracker falls. So we also, I also want to add that we also recently launched a program, and we are launching programs or aligning our work with supporting governments, such as I want to highlight a program that we are doing to certify emission reductions under government policies to support governments develop new regulations and policies aligned to their national objectives. So we have been doing the work so far and engaging with regulations across the world as they're emerging. And we hope to continue to do so through work that we are continuously innovating and designing. This is briefly how we see our role supporting national regulations. But I also want to add that as a standard, gold standard has a requirement under its terms and conditions to comply with national and local regulation. There's not to say that we as a standard have in our functioning the monitoring of different developments of regulations across the world with the perspective of compliance to these regulations, but to say that we can and we do advocate for regulations meeting their national objectives of sustainable development and regulations that support a high integrity, high impact, and an active market. So in this manner, we act as an enabler to ensure that the projects we certify are aligned with regulations and objectives, however, with certain boundaries, as I briefly mentioned before. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kavya. And I'm going to come back to you, Caroline. So, I mean, this is actually linked to some of the comments that Greg was making earlier. So Greg was talking about some specific examples of Rwanda and Ghana. And South Pole is kind of here in wearing a hat of creating the carbon markets tracker, but there is a separate hat which South Pole has, which is involved in project development. And I'd be interested if you could say a little bit more from the perspective of a project developer about what are the key things are when you're looking at new regulations in a jurisdiction, or maybe the absence of regulations. So what are the things that matter most from a project development perspective?
Thanks, Hugh. And yes, I share a lot of Greg's thinking here. It's interesting to see how a healthy competition is starting to play out between countries that are trying to position themselves and attract projects, carbon projects, and climate finance, and with how these regulations can create a more conducive environment for project developers. So when we advise clients on project development, what we look at in terms of the regulatory context, first of all, is predictability, clarity. As with any investment, you want to understand what the regulation is or will be, and how it will affect your projects and your work. Of course, you want simple process, clear timelines. What's very helpful, and Greg already indicated that too, is clarity on the project types, on the activities, on the technologies that will be eligible for various markets. In an ideal case, that happens through a positive list. Greg mentioned Ghana. We've seen India come out with a positive list. Chile is working on one, and there's more. And that gives a really clear black and white indication to project developers about which projects are of interest to the government for which purpose. And when you don't have that and you have to start interpreting an NDC, what's conditional, what's unconditional, what are the surrounding sector policies, and how may that lead the governments to authorize or not authorize a project, that's not always a straightforward exercise. So the more clarity you can get on that in the regulatory framework, the more attractive the environment becomes to work in. Specifically with Article 6, what you would also want is early assurance on authorizations. If you have to develop an entire mitigation activity design document and then submit that to the government and then get the first indication of whether or not they're actually interested in that project, you've potentially wasted 10 months of work. If the regulatory framework allows you to seek an early indication, for example, you submit a mitigation activity idea note and you get a letter of no objection, that can give a degree of assurance that the project is actually of interest and has a good shot at getting authorized. So that's really helpful. A big question, of course, is how revocations will be used, and we know that that's still being debated also at UN level, how and when authorization letters can be revised or revoked. As a project developer, seeing your letter of authorization revoked is the equivalent of having your building permit revoked when your tower is up. It's really the sort of government measure that seriously deters investment in the future. So it's not something you would want governments to do lightly, and it's a measure that you would want governments to only make use of in very serious circumstances, like when there are human rights concerns, for example. And then also with regard to authorization, there's a big question about how flexible these can be. Host countries can authorize projects under Article 6 for NDC use in a specific buyer country. For NDC used in a series of buyer countries, they can authorize it for CORSIA, or they can authorize it for all of the above. Now, if you are developing a project and the authorization applies only to one specific use case in one specific country, as a project developer, that means that if your deal falls through, if your buyer falls through, you're possibly you're sitting with a stranded asset. Essentially, you have no other options. Whereas if these authorizations are more flexible, you have fallback options. So again, it creates a much more conducive environment for project development. If these authorizations are flexible, it brings more fungibility into the market. And we're starting to see that with some of the letters coming out of Rwanda and Malawi, for example, where we're seeing that these are quite broad authorizations. So I would say those are the first issues that we look at when we assess regulatory context.
Yeah. And maybe just a general question for anyone who wants to take this then. I mean, some of these issues which we're seeing in the carbon market now they're not new in different sectors. You were saying that earlier. It's not new, the idea of a government revoking a permit or revoking something, but there have been ways in which this has been resolved. There's been international kind of efforts to standardize some approaches, letters, etc. And I'm just interested in whether, as we start to see new regulations emerging in different jurisdictions, are there one or two big things which you think could really help to provide some stability for investment? So international initiatives, international efforts that could help to provide some more security, or things which governments on their own could think about, which would provide that security in as we do start to see more regulatory risk coming through. So maybe Greg, Caroline, or Kavya. Oh. Greg, I think you're on mute if you're...
Sorry. Yeah, perhaps just jumping in there. I mean, one thing that's been very noticeable in the last year or so is the kind of booming carbon insurance space. These insurance firms are starting to move in to try and protect against all sorts of risks that we're seeing in the market, but most notably around the risk that governments might revoke the authorizations that they've given to credits. So if a country or company has purchased carbon credits to use towards a particular compliance obligation, and then down the line this is revoked by the host country, then they want some protection. And I think insurance is really the key or one key instrument that can be used that's going to begin to alleviate this market, because there are so many risks and so much uncertainty that it's giving the buyers a little bit more confidence, and the investors as they start to move into these markets. So there's numerous different forms that are being taken around this insurance. As I said, it's evolving quite quickly as new risks come, but I think that is one way in which the market is adapting and evolving to kind of protect against some of these risks and try to support the development of these markets.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm going to go now to some of the questions that have come through on the chat, and a lot of these are quite factual ones about the regulation tracker. So we might just in a second do a quick answer of some of those questions. But first, there was one which came through from Keshav about Article 6 readiness assessment, which Caroline, I'm going to come to you on, because I know that this is work which South Pole has supported governments on in the past. So Keshav has asked, if we can provide thoughts and approaches for undertaking Article 6 readiness assessments at the country level. So it'd be great if you could share a little bit more about some of the work which we're seeing globally to prepare for governments to prepare to implement Article 6.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, globally, there's quite an impressive level of effort going towards helping host countries prepare, and you have a wild range of actors going from World Bank, ADB, GGGI, UNDP, CASE, doing fabulous work in that sense, and providing technical assistance that is for players like us really important. And it's one of the first things that we will look at when we decide to work in a country or not, is has this country benefited from some of that support, from the international support that's in place. Other things that you would look at to assess the level of readiness would be what's the country's track record in the CDM? Can they build on institutions and experience and expertise that they have from the CDM? How far how are they in developing regulation, and how clear are we on the direction that the regulation is going into? Have they issued any authorizations before? What are the number of bilateral agreements that they have signed with buy-side countries? So those are some of the main things that we would look at to assess the level of readiness and to decide whether or not to work in a country or to prioritize it.
Yeah, great. And then I'm just going to go quickly through some of the other questions that we've received, which are more about the tracker. Daniel, feel free to come in if you want to in any of these, but I'll try to go through. So there's a few kind of points which have been made about jurisdictions which may not be listed currently. So Daniel, do you want to just say a little bit more about when regulations will be added to the tracker? So at what point? So if there is an idea, it won't be yet included on the regulations tracker, but Daniel, you can maybe just add a bit more about when we'll start to include regulations.
Yeah, I can take that. So generally, the approach that we will take is that during the full month, I mean, in the policy and strategy team, we always screen for new regulations, and then we filter the ones that will be relevant also for the tracker. And once these regulations become available towards the end of the month, they will be included in the tracker. I just think one thing to note is that we would be focusing on regulations where independent crediting standards do play a role. I think that's one of the few filters that we would apply, which consequently we have excluded certain regulations that are certainly carbon market focused, but would be sort of out of the context because there's no role for independent crediting standards in these.
Great, thank you. And I think that's an important answer to some. I mean, there was a couple of questions about the UK and UK ETS, for instance. And so I know in the UK there is a consultation underway right now about including removals credits within the UK ETS. And so, as an example, if that got to a point where credits were eligible within the UK ETS, there was a role for independent crediting standards, that would then be listed on the regulation tracker. But at this point where it's under consultation, it's not yet included. And this also then answers one of the questions which was included in the Q&A about the difference between this tracker and others. And we're very aware that there are different regulation trackers which exist globally. What we were really trying to do here was have something that was very specifically focused on regulations related to carbon credits and carbon credits from standards which have served the voluntary market in the past, so independent crediting programs. And that's to provide something which is kind of very simple, easy to access for those who are in this market. And that's really what we're trying to do here. And we're relying in this tracker on publicly available information as well. So if there are rumors about regulations that doesn't get reflected here, this is really objectively what information is in the public domain about existing regulations, draft regulations. That's what we're trying to do here. I think that answers some of the key questions that we've received through. One which has come through is whether the UNFCCC Secretariat will also prepare a similar overview. It's very possible they do. Again, I think this comes back to that question. They may be focused more on Article 6 if they do so, and we've tried to take a slightly broader view and also look at regulations affecting the voluntary market and then compliance markets, which may not be related to Article 6. And then questions about what to do if you think the regulation is missing. I think on the regulations tracker, there will be a way to get in touch with Gold Standard. Do feel free to do so if you have any questions which you want to ask us, if there's anything which you think is missing, and we'll be able to provide that to you. And then a question about the exact name of the Singapore carbon market regulation. And I would suggest you go to the tracker and you'll be able to find all the information and I think find your way to the regulation itself. I think that covers lots of the questions which we have in the chat. So I wanted to now come to two final questions. So one was directed towards Greg, but others may want to answer this as well. And it's, what are the one or two big regulatory developments that you're watching in the remainder of 2024? So what are the key things that market actors may want to look out for later this year?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think probably I can split this between supply side and demand side. So as we've touched upon quite a lot in the webinar, more and more countries are developing their carbon market frameworks. I'm watching around which additional countries release those. We know there's lots of countries working on them. I think we could see a few in parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia before the end of the year. Hopefully, as mentioned, with quite a lot of detail. So clear institutional structures, who does a project developer or investor need to communicate with, what administrative requirements are there, even elements, just thinking outside of kind of the Article 6 elements we've mentioned, is really clear fee structures. So what the fee sharing rules do, credits need to be carved out at all if they're to be sold, and cost structures. Because as I've mentioned, market participants really are not willing to invest and develop now with the kind of without regulatory certainty. And secondly, so that we can really, well, particularly looking at the Article 6 side then of these regulations, is start to see these markets develop that we've spent so much time talking about over the last few years. So see some Article 6 transfers start to build up, and even Corsia's phase 1 scheme, which requires authorizations for credits to move, which began at the start of this year to start to operationalize. And then on the demand side, as I've spoken a lot about supply side, on the demand side, we've touched upon these compliance markets that have built-in crediting mechanisms. I think compliance merging with the voluntary market is really becoming the key source of demand in the market, and will only continue to be so in the coming years. So we've seen and heard a lot of countries now developing things such as emissions trading schemes and carbon taxes with crediting mechanisms built in, as you mentioned, all in the tracker you've launched, and they're doing this as a response to both achieving their NDCs and somewhat in a response to the CBAM out of the EU. So that's going to be really exciting to see how some of those develop. I'm particularly thinking of some of the biggest jurisdictions such as Brazil and India, who've been talking about these systems and putting preparations in place around that. Will we get clarity on exactly how those systems are going to look before the end of the year? Probably the two big things I'm keeping an eye on.
Great. Anyone want to add anything else on this question?
I might jump in here. I mean, it's hard to answer because there's so much to be excited about, and what's happening in the market. I think Vietnam really is a space to watch. They've taken such a beautifully structured approach to things, developing their domestic scheme, developing the ETS that's now underway, and we're working with the government and UNOPS on that, and then developing the Article 6 framework. sort of on the back of that. So it's really very sort of coherent, well thought through. So I'm really curious to see where that is going. Curious to see where Indonesia is going. They were one of the first to be out there with a regulation, but then also quickly saw that there were a few kinks to iron out. But now with the new government, there seems to be a good appetite to iron that out. So it's of course a massive market, and I'm very curious to see where Indonesia goes. On the buy side, I'm very much watching New Zealand. They've announced targets. They've been doing their analysis, and I'm curious to see what sort of procurement approach they are going to take. So those are some of the examples that come to mind in the next few months.
Great, thank you. So essentially, this will very much be a live tracker that we have, because as we've heard there is more to expect from different jurisdictions over this next period, and we will keep the tracker updated with support from South Pole to cover all of this as well. Sorry, Kavya, you were going to come in as well, I think there.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on the last question, just not to repeat anything that Greg and Caroline had already said, but yeah, from our side and from the perspective of government regulations, I'd be curious to see how government regulations develop, especially countries like Indonesia and countries that have been building up a lot of anticipation into what their government regulations will look like and how they'll be interacting with project developers. And this comes back to a question that you'd asked earlier as well on what governments could do to provide more security and trust in the market. And I just want to highlight, which has been highlighted several times before as well, that more information and more clarity and more guidance from governments is something that would provide more security in the market. And that's the basis of most things that come after that. So how new laws and policies and frameworks will develop in interaction with the different actors in the market, especially actors that are directly affected by the framework. And yeah, just to say that I'm curious to see how these things develop.
Yeah. Great. So we just have 3 minutes left, which doesn't give you very long to answer a very difficult last question, which I have for each of you, which I'll come to in a second. Just before I do, we've had a question through from Jamie Connolly about whether there'll be a traffic light system in the future based on the strength of countries' regulations. That's not something we're planning to do. We're planning to provide information, so there's access to information, but not from gold standard to provide any assessment of the quality or strength of different regulations. But as we were sharing earlier, Abatable through their platform does provide some more assessment on not on quality, but kind of on risk and kind of quality of the regulatory framework overall. So my final question, and I welcome answers in 30 seconds if that's possible. You've kind of talked about it a little bit, but very simply, is a more regulated carbon market, which is what we seem to be moving towards, a good or a bad thing for the objectives that we all have for how the market will grow? So I'll go first to Caroline.
Yes. It's undoubtedly a good thing. Initially, when regulations start developing, it of course creates nervousness. You don't know how your project will be affected. But once the dust settles, regulations create markets. They create opportunities. They drive climate ambition, and they will strengthen the trust and the integrity of the market. So it's very much a good thing. Some of the most exciting and impactful innovations in the carbon markets have happened when regulators got involved, and the EU ETS is of course the first example that comes to mind there. So we're really upbeat about where the market is headed.
Great. Kavya, I'll go to you next.
So we are, as we could see, we are headed towards a more regulated carbon market, definitely. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it depends on how regulations come to form, but also there is a clear need for regulation, because without the presence of regulation, it's hard to ensure certain objectives are met, and these objectives are to serve the very purpose of what these projects are trying to achieve. So with the absence of regulations, it would be difficult to meet this, because that would be a very ideal world to meet the Paris Agreement goals, for example, without a regulated carbon market. So I definitely do think it's a good thing that regulations are coming into play, but we need to see how these develop, and also support the market in a way, as we do at Gold Standard, to develop and design new regulations as much as we can to meet the higher objectives.
Thank you. And then the final word to Greg.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not going to say anything controversial here. I'm also going to say, yes, regulation is good. I think both on the demand and supply side, market stakeholders are now looking for regulation, and the market needs regulation to scale. My caveat would probably be that I would just hope that regulation is developed in consultation with market participants and capacity builders, some of the ones Caroline touched upon earlier. It's a new space, it's new regulation, it is difficult, and market participants can bring some experience, both good and bad, that can really help shape the process and make sure we get this right as quickly as possible. So yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has joined this webinar and stayed with us for the past hour. Thank you very much to South Pole for their support in developing the tracker itself and for being here on the webinar to present it. They're not here, but to the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action for their support for our work on this. Thanks to Abatable, to Greg for joining this panel. You can find the tracker on our website. As we've mentioned earlier, it will be kept live over the period ahead. We will look at how we can provide updates when this is updated as well, so that you are aware of that as well. And we hope that there are more webinars which we can come forward with in the near future, which are looking at some similar issues as well. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone.